Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I am headed to the Library of Congress specifically to check out and share with you an exhibit there called The Two Georges: Parallel Lives in an Age of Revolution. I thought this exhibit would be a great segue into July content here on our channel while we are living in Washington, D.C., following the many videos we did in May and June talking about Revolutionary War history. The Two Georges explores and compares the lives and legacies of both King George III, who was born in 1738 and ruled as King of England from 1760 until his death in 1820, and our very own President George Washington, who was born in 1732 and served as president from 1775 until 1783, then spent 4 years in retirement before he died in 1799. There are rare manuscripts, letters, maps, and personal artifacts in this exhibit to bring to life not only the revolutionary clash between these two figures, but also the many ways their lives were parallel to one another and the many similarities they shared. Tied by an empire and divided by a war, these two men helped shape the course of history from opposite sides of the Atlantic, and I am super excited to be here and share this experience with you. Most people think of George Washington and King George III as opponents and opposites. Our understanding of them is clouded by myths about Washington's cherry tree and wooden teeth, and George III's tyranny and his reputation as the Mad King. But their writings, featured in this exhibition, tell a fuller story, revealing them as people we can get to know. This exhibition brings together 3 extraordinary collections for the first time: George Washington's papers from the Library of Congress, George III's scientific instruments from the Science Museum Group in London, and George III's papers from the Royal Collection and Royal Archives. These materials allow us to examine the parallel lives of these two men who were born just 6 years apart. They show how both were shaped by the British Empire, the Enlightenment, and the Revolution. They reveal their shared interests in science and agriculture and illuminate how they approached the challenges of their time, including war, slavery, politics, and the pressures of public life. George Washington, born in Virginia in 1732, seems the embodiment of the American Republic. Yet he spent the first part of his life as a British subject. He promoted the interests of the British Empire as a soldier and as a surveyor, and he formed himself on the model of a British gentleman, taking advantage of colonial ladders of power. It was only when Washington took up arms against Britain in 1775 that he became an American. King George III, born in London in 1738, ascended to the British throne at age 22 on the death of his grandfather, King George II. The empire he ruled stretched from America to Africa to Asia. Despite the differences in their early lives, the two Georges were linked by their common roots in the British Empire. George Washington's older half-brothers were sent to school in England, but his education was curtailed with his father's death. Learning on his own as a teenager, Washington copied a set of 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation into his diary. The text originated in 16th century France and was later translated into English. It was popular during Washington's youth. This diary entry was from 1747, when he would have been about 14 or 15 years old. George Washington was born into a society and an economy grounded in slavery. His father, Augustine Washington, left his son George some land and an unspecified number of slaves in his 1743 will. When George turned 18, he came into possession of 11 enslaved people: Fortune, George, Long Joe, Winna, Bellandar, Jenny, Adam, Nat, London, Milla, and Frank. In 1749, Frederick, Prince of Wales, wrote this set of instructions for his 11-year-old son, the future King George III. In them, he advises the future king to live with economy, reduce the national debt, avoid war, and remember that, for a king, a true friend is difficult to be found. 2 years later, Frederick died without ever becoming king himself. London portrait painter Bartholomew Dandridge made this portrait of Frederick, Prince of Wales, in 1732. Frederick was the father of the future George III. George Washington's future wife, Martha Dandridge, was the painter's niece. Despite the distance that separated the two Georges and their families, they were all products of the British Empire's intersecting worlds. This drawing shows the future George III as a boy of about 9 years old. With a book, sword, gun, hat, and makeshift tent draped over chairs, he is anticipating his future as a military leader. Both Georges lost their fathers when they were young. Augustine Washington died in 1743 when his son was 11. Frederick, Prince of Wales, died in 1751 when Prince George was 12. Both fathers provided for their sons in ways appropriate for their projected futures. Prince Frederick wrote a set of instructions to guide his son, the future king. Augustine Washington provided his son with land and enslaved laborers so he could grow tobacco, which was colonial Virginia's contribution to the British economy. No one could have predicted a future in which the two Georges would come face to face on the world stage. As young men, George Washington and the future George III studied geometry, draftsmanship, and surveying. Washington worked as a land surveyor between the ages of 17 and 20. He measured and mapped land for settlers on Virginia's frontier, work that helped expand British territory in North America. George III was a competent draftsman and included a surveyor's compass in his collection of scientific instruments. He shared Washington's interest in surveying, if not its practical application. This here is actually George III's survey compass. As a teenager, George Washington made these surveying notes and drawings in his school copybook. He used these skills later when he became a professional land surveyor. This journal documents Washington's work surveying land in the Blue Ridge Mountains when he was just 16 years old. The land belonged to Lord Thomas Fairfax, who had once served at the court of King George I. Washington regarded Lord Fairfax as a patron and was connected to the Fairfax family through the marriage of his half-brother Lawrence to Anne Fairfax. As a young man studying draftsmanship and geometry, Prince George drew these geometric studies and this landscape. Like George Washington, he learned by copying from other books. George Washington began his military career as a young officer during the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. This was the American dimension of a larger conflict between the French and British empires known as the 7 Years' War. Washington fought alongside British forces in the Ohio River Valley, where British and French forces and their Native American allies competed for territory. The future George III was a teenager when the war began. His grandfather, King George II, refused to let him join the fight despite his pleas. When George II died in 1760, George III inherited the conflict. George Washington helped to spark the French and Indian War when his troops attacked a French party in present-day Pennsylvania in 1754. Washington wrote to his brother, "I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in that sound." King George II later read Washington's boast in the London Magazine and commented, He would not say so if he had been used to hear many. On July 9, 1755, George Washington fought near French Fort Duquesne, near present-day Pittsburgh. The Battle of the Monongahela resulted in the death of British General Edward Braddock, whom Washington was serving as aide-de-camp. In this letter to his mother, Mary Ball, Washington wrote, "I luckily escaped without a wound, though I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot out under me." As the 7 Years' War raged on, George, Prince of Wales, asked his grandfather, King George II, for his permission to join the fight. To his great frustration, the king refused. As the oldest son and the heir to the British throne, it was safest to keep him at home. This map shows the Proclamation Line established by the British in 1763 in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. The line along the Appalachians created a western boundary beyond which settlers were forbidden to acquire land. By limiting the expansion of British settlement into Indian Territory, the British hoped to minimize conflict with Native Americans. The Proclamation Line was not only ineffectual, but it also angered George Washington and other colonists who wanted to maintain access to Western land. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act to raise revenue after the French and Indian War. The act required Americans to pay a tax on all paper and parchment documents, including newspapers, almanacs, and even playing cards. Many Americans, including George Washington, reacted with anger. They considered it to be taxation without representation. Parliament repealed the act in 1766, but Britain continued to assert control over the colonies. King George III gradually hardened in his view that he must control his American colonies to protect the integrity of the British Empire. Meanwhile, George Washington found a prominent place for himself in the thick of the American resistance. The Stamp Act had angered many Americans. In a letter to Francis Dandridge, one of his wife Martha's uncles in London, George Washington wrote that the colonists look upon this unconstitutional method of taxation as a direful attack upon their liberties. Washington warned that the Americans could do without the many luxuries that we lavish our substance to Great Britain for. Faced with opposition from American colonists and British merchants, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. In this memorandum, George III records the evolution of his views on the act. He writes, "I thought repealing infinitely more eligible than enforcing, which could only tend to widen the breach between this country and America." When the First Continental Congress drafted this petition to King George III in 1774, they still hoped that reconciliation might be possible. The petition begins, "We, your Majesty's faithful subjects," and asks that the king restore them to their rights as English freemen. George Washington, then a delegate from Virginia, signed the petition. This is one of 2 copies that Congress sent to Benjamin Franklin, who was then a colonial agent in London. Franklin delivered one to the king and kept this one for himself. As the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in September of 1774, George III wrote his Prime Minister Lord North, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph. I do not wish to come to severer measures, but we must not retreat. By coolness and an unremitted pursuit of the measures that have been adopted, I trust they will come to submit." Philadelphia newspaper publisher William Bradford supported American resistance and opposed the Stamp Act. He placed this mocking design on the front page of his newspaper to protest the act. This map shows the battles of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, which broke out on April 19, 1775. The fighting marked the start of the American Revolution. On June 19, 1775, the Continental Congress commissioned George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington was then 43 years old and a veteran of the French and Indian War. On receiving the appointment, he wrote to his wife Martha, "I should enjoy more real happiness and felicity in 1 month with you at home than I have the most distant prospect of reaping abroad if my stay here were to be 7 times 7 years." In this speech to Parliament, George III expressed his determination to crush the rebellion. He stated that the time had come to put a speedy end to these disorders with the most decisive exertions. He promised that if any of these misled should become sensible of their error, he would receive them back with tenderness and mercy. Editions of this broadside were published in New York and Philadelphia. John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress, sent Washington this first printing of the Declaration of Independence. He wrote that Washington should have it proclaimed at the head of the army in the way you shall think it most proper. The Declaration's list of grievances helped cement in Americans' minds the idea that George III was a tyrant. On July 9th, with British ships visible offshore, Washington had it read aloud to the assembled troops in New York. John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, was the last colonial governor of Virginia. In November 1775, he issued this proclamation offering to free any indentured servants or enslaved people belonging to the rebels who would join His Majesty's troops. Washington called Dunmore the arch traitor to the rights of humanity. In this letter to his Prime Minister, George III wrote, "The present contest with America I cannot help seeing as the most serious in which any country was ever engaged. Whether the laying a tax was deserving all the evils that have arisen from it, I should suppose no man would allege that without being thought more fit for Bedlam than a seat in the Senate. Bedlam was a notorious hospital for the mentally ill in London." On April 19, 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord. Soon after, George Washington wrote to a friend in England, "Unhappy it is, though, to reflect that a brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's heart." George III also regretted that war had broken out between Britain and its American colonies. In a speech to Parliament that October, he offered forgiveness with tenderness and mercy to those colonists who became sensible of their error. But after the American Declaration of Independence in 1776 and more than 8 years of war, the break between the two Georges and their nations was complete. Although the two Georges never met, the American Revolution brought them into direct conflict. George Washington experienced the war on the battlefield as commander of the American Continental Army, while King George III directed his generals from across the Atlantic. After the war, George III was so distraught over the loss of America that he considered abdicating his throne. Washington, victorious, resigned his commission and returned to private life at Mount Vernon. George III claimed that this act made Washington the greatest man in the world. During the American Revolution, both Georges took a personal interest in spying and secret operations. George Washington established the Culper Spy Ring, which operated around British-occupied New York City. Washington's spies used false names, a secret code, and invisible ink to share information about British movements. In 1782, Washington approved a plan to kidnap George III's son, Prince William Henry, who was serving as a naval officer in New York. Washington canceled the plan after his sources informed him that the prince would be too well guarded to capture. George III also corresponded with spies, including one called Aristarchus, who kept the king informed about the movements of Benjamin Franklin in Paris. The true identity of Aristarchus has never been discovered. In 1778, George Washington set up a spy network around New York City, then occupied by the British. Culper was the name assumed by Abraham Woodhull and Robert Townsend. Benjamin Talmadge ran the spy ring. He devised the numerical codes in this book. The Culper spies used this code to report on the movements of British ships and troops. This page shows Washington identified as 711. Members of the Culper spy ring used an invisible ink developed by James Jay, a doctor and a chemist. He was a brother of John Jay, later an author of the Federalist Papers and the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. In this letter, Washington gives his chief spy, Benjamin Talmadge, instructions for using what he called white ink. Culper Jr., mentioned here, was Robert Townsend, another member of the ring. Aristarchus was the name used by a British spy who reported directly to King George III. In this letter, he reports on the movements of Benjamin Franklin, who was serving as the U.S. minister to France. Aristarchus writes that Franklin was rumored to be going to The Hague in the Netherlands, but it is now beyond a doubt this veteran negotiator is going to America. In 1781, King George III's son, Prince William Henry, was serving in the Royal Navy in British-occupied New York. In this letter to his father, he describes the empty pedestal that once held the king's statue before American crowds tore it down. He also refers to Brave Arnold. This was Benedict Arnold, the American officer who defected to the British. Arnold tried but failed to deliver the American fort at West Point, New York, to the British. In this letter, Washington approved Colonel Matthias Ogden's plan to capture Prince William Henry and the British admiral who accompanied him. Washington later warned Ogden that the prince would probably be too well guarded to capture, and the plan was never executed. In 1830, the prince succeeded his brother, King George IV, and became King William IV. France's decision to ally with the United States in 1778 was critical to American success in the Revolutionary War. France was America's first ally and Britain's old enemy. As recently as 1763, Britain and France had been at war in North America. When Britain won the French and Indian War, France lost all of its territory on the American continent. George III feared that the alliance between France and the United States could trigger renewed conflict with France. On February 6, 1778, France signed 2 treaties with the United States. This Treaty of Amity and Commerce and a Treaty of Alliance. The United States had been seeking an alliance with France since the start of the Revolution. America's victory over Britain at the Battle of Saratoga in the autumn of 1777 convinced France to enter the war as America's ally. This print shows Washington in an imagined battlefield holding the Treaty of Alliance with France and the Declaration of Independence. At his feet are torn-up copies of papers proposing reconciliation with Britain. The turbaned man holding Washington's horse is probably intended to portray William Lee. Lee was an enslaved valet who served Washington for many years. He was the only enslaved person Washington immediately freed in his will. As France moved towards an alliance with the United States, George III feared war between France and Britain. At that moment, his anxious Prime Minister, Lord North, threatened to resign. The king urged him to stay and to refrain from considering peace with America. "Whatever can be proposed," he wrote, will be liable not to bring America back to a sense of attachment to the mother country, yet to dissatisfy this country. The sugar plantations on Britain's Caribbean islands were a significant source of revenue for Britain. They were also among the most brutal environments for the enslaved Africans who worked there. When France allied with the United States, King George III feared losing these island colonies. "Our islands must be defended even at the risk of an invasion of this island," he wrote, referring to Britain itself. "If we lose our sugar islands, it will be impossible to raise money to continue the war." This cartoon shows the United States, represented as a horse, throwing off its rider, King George III. It was published not long after the American alliance with France. In the background, a soldier carries a flag decorated with fleur-de-lis, a symbol of France. This French print depicts the Battle of Yorktown, the last major battle of the American Revolution. It shows the British Army led by General Charles Cornwallis and the combined American and French armies headed by Generals George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau. George Washington began keeping a diary as a teenager. He stopped during the American Revolution, overwhelmed by events. He started again on May 1, 1781, regretting not having attempted it from the commencement of the war. On this page, he records the surrender of British General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. During this period, Washington hired secretaries to copy his wartime correspondence into fresh letter books. George III wrote this letter to his prime minister during the treaty negotiations that ended the American Revolution. "I cannot conclude without mentioning how sensibly I feel the dismemberment of America from this empire," he wrote. He added that knavery seems to be so much the striking feature of its inhabitants that it may not, in the end, be an evil that they become aliens to this kingdom. George III copied this essay on the loss of the American colonies from British agricultural writer Arthur Young. Young corresponded with both George III and George Washington. The essay begins, "America is lost. Must we fall beneath the blow, or have we resources that may repair the mischiefs?" Less than a week after Britain and the United States agreed on the terms of a peace treaty, George III appeared before Parliament. Reluctantly, and for the first time, he declared the rebellious colonies free and independent states. In this letter, Virginia statesman Edmund Pendleton marvels, "What a change of sentiments does this speech breathe when compared to former. They really contain those of a patriot king." On October 19, 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown, Virginia. The Battle of Yorktown was the last major battle of the American Revolution, yet neither George believed the conflict was really over. Washington warned state and national leaders to remain on their guard. George III hoped the war would continue, despite the opposition of much of his government. British troops remained in America, and sporadic fighting continued until the Treaty of Paris was signed in September of 1783, officially ending the war. The treaty that ended the American Revolution was signed in Paris on September 3, 1783. The news took 2 months to reach George Washington. When it did, Washington traveled to New York, where he bid farewell to his officers and watched the last of the British troops evacuate the city. Washington then traveled to Annapolis, Maryland, where he addressed Congress and resigned his military commission before returning to Mount Vernon. When George III learned of the treaty, he feared that the loss of the American colonies would threaten the integrity of Britain's empire and its standing among European powers. He, too, considered resigning and even drafted an abdication letter. He wrote this note, which he never sent, as the Treaty of Paris was being finalized, but he remained on the throne. American artist Benjamin West was a court painter to George III. He told a fellow artist, Joseph Farington, this story dating back to the end of the American Revolution. Farington recorded it in his diary. Quote, "The king began to talk about America. He asked West what would Washington do were America to be declared independent. West said he believed Washington would retire to a private situation. The king said that if he did, he would be the greatest man in the world." On December 23, 1783, George Washington resigned his military commission before Congress in Annapolis. "Having now finished the work assigned me," he said, "I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life." George Washington and George III were both the oldest sons of widowed mothers. Mary Ball Washington was born in Virginia around 1708. She was the daughter of an indentured servant and a prosperous tobacco planter. Orphaned as a child, she became the second wife of Augustine Washington, a widower with 3 children. Augusta, Princess of Wales, was born in Germany in 1719. She married Frederick, Prince of Wales, at age 17. Both women attracted criticism for the control they were presumed to wield over their sons when they were young. Only recently have historians and biographers begun to reassess them, taking into account the prejudices and limitations they faced as women. The child on the far left, wearing a dress and seated on a cushion, is the future King George III. The other 2 children are his brother Prince Edward and sister Princess Augusta. The women are governesses Arabella Herbert and Lady Jane Hamilton, Mistress of the Robes. The man standing behind the princess is Sir William Irby, Vice Chancellor to the Princess Augusta. George Washington had a difficult relationship with his mother, who raised him and his siblings on her own after his father died. He dictated this chilly letter to a secretary when he was 55 years old and his mother was nearing 80. He complained that she had taken all the proceeds of the plantation Washington rented from her, leaving him without 1 farthing. He added that, because of her complaints, "I am viewed as a delinquent and considered perhaps by the world as an unjust and undutiful son." Mary Ball, the mother of Washington, has been the subject of too much sentimental writing, but the cold record of her own and her son's letters shows her to have been grasping, querulous, and vulgar. She was a selfish and exacting mother, whom most of her children avoided as soon and as early as they could, to whom they did their duty but rendered little else. When the future King George III turned 18, his grandfather, King George II, offered him the opportunity to leave his mother's house and live at court. The prince replied to his grandfather's offer in this letter to Lord Waldegrave, his governor. He accepted the allowance, but chose to remain at Leicester Square, where he and his brother Prince Edward lived next door to their mother, Augusta, Dowager Princess of Wales. This caricature shows a young George III sleeping in his mother's lap. On the left, the Earl of Bute, George III's tutor and an important early influence, steals the king's scepter. On the right, the politician Henry Fox, Lord Holland, picks his pocket. King George III and George Washington were both known as the fathers of their countries, but they were also fathers themselves. George III and Queen Charlotte had 15 children. George Washington had no biological children of his own, but he was stepfather to Martha Washington's children from her first marriage. He also helped raise nieces, nephews, and grandchildren. Both Georges and their families were influenced by Enlightenment ideas about humanitarianism and individual rights, as well as older beliefs about hierarchy and dominance. They both made practical marriages and settled into family lives that projected domestic contentment. As powerful patriarchs, they controlled the lives of family members, including rebellious children and, in Washington's case, the enslaved families who served him. This family portrait shows George and Martha Washington with their grandchildren, George Washington Parke Custis on the left and Eleanor Parke Custis in the center. The man standing at the right has been variously identified as William Lee or Christopher Shields, both of whom served Washington as enslaved valets, but he may also be an imagined figure. In an age of rebellion, the Washingtons, like the royal family, had to contend with unruly children. George Washington helped raise Martha's two surviving children from her first marriage, John Parke Custis, known as Jackie, and Martha Parke Custis, known as Patsy. Patsy died from an epileptic seizure in 1773 at the age of 17. Martha Washington spoiled Jackie, her only surviving child, while George Washington supervised the education of his rebellious stepson. Jackie died of camp fever in 1781, shortly after the British surrender at Yorktown. He was 26 years old. Jackie left behind a widow and 4 children. The Washingtons informally adopted 2 of these, Eleanor Parke Custis and George Washington Parke Custis. Washington also supervised the children of his deceased brother Samuel. He was exasperated when some of them behaved irresponsibly. At the time of George Washington's death, there were 317 enslaved people living at Mount Vernon. This number included many families. Marriages between enslaved couples were not recognized by law, leaving families vulnerable to separation. The condition of slavery passed from mother to child with no regard for the rights of either parent. Washington's need for labor on his 5 farms took precedence for him over the needs or wishes of the enslaved families whose lives he controlled. George III never saw the enslaved people who labored on the plantations that enriched his kingdom, but he was no less complicit in the institution of slavery. From 1786 until his death, George Washington required detailed weekly reports from the managers of his 5 farms at Mount Vernon. He intended these as a record of the work at his farms. The reports also document the lives of Mount Vernon's enslaved people. Managers listed days of work lost by sickness, including childbirths. In this report, a woman named Grace is recorded giving birth to a child. This may be her son Roger, who appears as a 10-year-old on a list Washington made in 1799. When Washington married Martha Dandridge Curtis in 1759, he gained control of the estate of her first husband, Daniel Parke Curtis, who died in 1757. Washington used this almanac to list the value of the estate's crops and enslaved workers. One of these was Betty, a seamstress and a spinner. The breakup of an estate could separate enslaved families, but Betty came to Mount Vernon with her young son Austin. Years later, Betty's daughter, Ona Judge, would escape President Washington's home in Philadelphia for a life of freedom. Around the time he made his will, Washington made this list of enslaved people at Mount Vernon. It includes people he owned outright, people who belonged to the estate of Martha Washington's first husband, known as dower slaves, and people he rented from a neighbor. In his will, Washington was only able to free the people he owned outright. This list includes a 10-year-old boy at Dog Run Farm named Roger, the son of a woman named Grace. He is probably the same child whose birth is recorded in the farm report on March 6, 1790. Architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe made this watercolor after a visit to Mount Vernon in July 1796, the summer before Washington retired from presidency. George and Martha Washington are seated at a tea table on the piazza. Martha Washington's grown granddaughter, Eleanor Parke Curtis, is standing as her dog Frisk romps on the lawn. Martha Washington's son, John Parke Curtis, known as Jackie, was the only one of her 4 children with her first husband to survive into adulthood. In this letter, Jackie's teacher reports that he had developed passions for racing, fox hunting, guns, dress, and girls, but, quote, he does not much like books. I must confess to you, I never did in my life know a youth so exceedingly indolent, or so surprisingly voluptuous. One would suppose nature had intended him for some Asiatic prince. In 1761, George Washington placed this ad in the Maryland Gazette to try to recover 4 enslaved men who escaped from Mount Vernon. You can see an enlargement of the ad on the left. George Washington placed these newspaper advertisements to try to recover enslaved people who escaped from Mount Vernon in 1761 and from Philadelphia in 1796. Today, we can read these ads for a different purpose, to learn about the lives of these individuals. The ads contain information about the escapees, including descriptions of how they looked, the clothes they wore, and how they spoke. The ads also describe their characters, histories, and probable destinations. King George and Queen Charlotte had 15 children together, 6 daughters and 9 sons, of whom 13 lived to adulthood. Not unlike the American colonies, some of the king's children rebelled against what they considered to be his tyranny. In 1772, George III pushed for the passage of the Royal Marriages Act, which prevented members of his family from marrying without his consent. The result was a spate of secret marriages and illegitimate children among the princes. Meanwhile, the 6 princesses languished in what they called the nunnery. The royal couple's struggles with their rebellious children made them not so different from other families in this rebellious era, including the Washingtons. To the left of the king and queen are princes George, Frederick, William, Edward, Ernest, and Augustus. To the right are princesses Charlotte, Augusta, Elizabeth, Mary, Sophia, Amelia, and Prince Adolphus. 2 boys, Alfred and Octavius, had died by the time this painting was made in 1794. This cartoon shows George III and Queen Charlotte in 1787 admiring hats and muffs at a Windsor milliner's shop. They are accompanied by several young women, probably intended to represent their daughters. The royal family is represented here as not much different from any other prosperous British family. George III and Queen Charlotte started the association of the royal family with ordinary British family life that continues to this day. George, Prince of Wales, was the oldest son of George III and Queen Charlotte and heir to the throne. He was intelligent, confident, charming, and a connoisseur and collector of art, but his extravagance, wildness, and alliance with his father's political opponents disappointed his parents. When George III was permanently disabled by illness in 1811, the prince took over as Prince Regent. When his father died in 1820, he became King George IV. Even with the constraints imposed by their father, Prince George and his brothers had much more freedom than their 6 sisters. Fed up with the tedium of life at Windsor Castle, the princesses threatened to quit this paternal roof if they were not allowed to participate in London social life from time to time. The Prince Regent successfully interceded with Queen Charlotte on their behalf. The Prince Regent's irresponsible behavior made him a favorite target for caricaturists such as James Gillray. The period known as the Regency was characterized by his extravagant tastes. This hand-colored etching is from 1792. George III wrote this letter to his son, the Prince of Wales, rebuking him in the third person for his debts and extravagance. Quote, "I constantly suffer from his reprehensible conduct, which has grown worse every year," he wrote. "If he is resolved to ruin his character, at least I will not bear any part of the blame." Queen Charlotte wrote this letter to George III after her brother proposed that his son come to England to look over their 6 daughters and choose one to marry. The king replied, "I cannot deny that I have never wished to see any of them married. I am happy in their company and do not want at least a separation." 3 of their daughters later married during their brother's regency when their father was no longer able to object. George III was an important patron of scientists and explorers, including Captain James Cook, naturalist Joseph Banks, and astronomer William Herschel. He also amassed a significant collection of scientific instruments, much of which is now held at the Science Museum in London. While George Washington did not have the king's resources, he shared George III's passion for the sciences. As president, Washington hoped to establish a national university in the nation's capital. In his last State of the Union address, Washington acknowledged the importance of a flourishing state of the arts and sciences to national prosperity and reputation. This is an armillary sphere, a mechanical model of the universe. This one was made in 1731 by London instrument maker Jonathan Sisson for George III's father, Prince Frederick. In 1789, George Washington visited an orrery, a model of the solar system, at Harvard University. He described it as a curious piece of mechanism for showing the revolutions of the Sun, Earth, and many other planets. In this memorandum, Royal astronomer Stephen de Mainbray describes the transit of Venus, or the movement of the planet Venus across the Sun, which occurred on June 3, 1769. None now living will see the same phenomena again, which will only happen again in 1874 and again in 2004, he wrote. George III witnessed the event from his observatory at Richmond. Measurements taken around the world at that time allowed scientists to calculate the size of the solar system. This quadrilateral is part of a set that likely belonged to scientist Stephen de Mainbray, who instructed the future George III on natural philosophy. Natural philosophy encompassed many modern scientific fields, including chemistry, physics, geology, and astronomy. The hooks attached to the corners of this wooden shape were used in experiments that demonstrated the concept of the center of gravity. This telescope belonged to Dr. James Lind of Edinburgh. It is believed to be the one he used to watch the transit of Venus in 1769. Later, he became physician to George III and his family at Windsor Castle. Today, this telescope is part of the King George III collection at London's Science Museum. These pages are from the Washington's household expense book, kept while they lived in Philadelphia during Washington's presidency. Their house was then both a family home and a place where American officials and foreign diplomats met. The purchases listed here include a bonnet and feathers for Martha Washington and a pair of gloves for Kennedy to wear when putting on table ornaments. Patrick Kennedy was a household servant. The expense book also reveals that Martha Washington was a committed reader. It records the purchase of 14 books for her, including a Lady's Geography and Mary Wollstonecraft's Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. George Washington served as president of the Constitutional Congress, which met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. There, delegates from every state met to draft a federal constitution. Near the end of the convention, a committee of delegates had a draft of the Constitution printed, and each delegate received a copy. Washington's copy, displayed here, includes the notes he made, probably as he was sitting in Carpenter's Hall discussing the text with his fellow delegates. As the first president of the United States, George Washington realized that everything he did would set a precedent. Both George and Martha Washington were anxious as they approached their new roles. Washington wondered how a president could avoid seeming like a king. George III's throne was ancient, but his pathway to it was not foreordained. His great-grandfather, George I, was born in Hanover, Germany. He jumped ahead of his Catholic cousins in 1714 because Britain wanted a Protestant king. George III was the first Hanoverian king to be born in England and speak English as a first language. When he took the throne in 1760, he reassured his subjects he was born and educated in this country. I see glory in the name of Britain. George Washington delivered this address in the Senate chamber of Federal Hall in New York, which was then the nation's capital. He began on a modest note, admitting that no event could have filled him with greater anxieties than the news that he had been elected president. Then he reminded his listeners that the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty depended on the American people. During his first weeks as president, George Washington asked his vice president, John Adams, and members of his cabinet for advice on how to conduct himself in the new office. In this letter, he asks Adams how a president might maintain the dignity of office without subjecting himself to the imputation of superciliousness or unnecessary reserve. He was conscious that the precedents he set would affect the office for years to come. Within a month of George Washington's inauguration as the first president of the United States, Congress began a debate over what title the new president should have. In this letter, James Madison, then a congressman from Virginia, described the debate to Thomas Jefferson, who was then the U.S. Minister to France. Madison used a code to conceal the fact that Congress had debated calling the president His Highness the President of the United States and Protector of their Liberties. Jefferson translated the code between the lines. Like her husband, Martha Washington would have preferred to stay at Mount Vernon rather than travel to New York to take on a new role. In this letter, she expresses her doubts to her friend, author Mercy Otis Warren. I had anticipated that from this moment we should have left to grow old in the solitude and tranquility together. That was, my dear madam, the first and dearest wish of my heart, but in that I have been disappointed. To honor their president as he traveled from Mount Vernon to New York for his inauguration, Americans drew on traditions that would have been familiar to Britons watching their king making a royal progress. The bridge at Gray's Ferry outside Philadelphia was decorated with triumphal arches by artist Charles Willson Peale. As Washington crossed, a child dressed in white dropped a laurel wreath on his head. British politician Henry St. John, 1st Viscount Bolingbroke, published The Idea of a Patriot King in 1749. In the book, he opposed factionalism as expressed by political parties. He argued that a constitutional monarch's function was to reign disinterestedly and benevolently over his whole people, kind of like a father of the country. When George III became king, he made Bolingbroke's ideas central to his philosophy of governing. As president, George Washington shared this interpretation of national leadership. Like George Washington, George III made notes as he read. These notes, in the form of essays, are in the King's papers at the Royal Archives. This essay explores the power vested in the king or queen. It is based on George III's reading of William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. Blackstone's commentaries, first published in 1765, were also influential in the American colonies, including Washington's Virginia. In these memoirs, George III records the events of the day in 1760 when his grandfather, George II, died and he became king. Unlike his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, George III was born in England rather than Germany and spoke English as his first language. George Washington knew that the new nation had to impress foreign diplomats who were used to the sparkle of European courts. At the same time, a Republican court could not emulate monarchy too closely. Washington asked his friend Gouverneur Morris to pick out appropriate tableware in France for the president's house. Morris assured the president that everything he chose was substantially good and majestically plain. Abigail Adams experienced both the royal and Republican courts. She met George III and Queen Charlotte in London when her husband, John Adams, was the first American minister to Britain. When he became Washington's vice president, she played a key role in establishing the new Republican court. In this letter to her husband, Queen Charlotte complains about the public appearances she has to make, including promenades on the terrace at Windsor Castle. "We live in a constant battle," she wrote. "I may now begin to feel the consequences of this life." In George III's Britain, as in George Washington's America, women could neither vote nor hold office, but they did participate in politics as bearers of news, wielders of influence, and hostesses of social events. Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, was notorious for her public participation in political campaigns. She supported the Whigs, the king's political opponents. This cartoon shows her on the right holding a fox meant to represent the Whig leader Charles James Fox, 1784. On becoming king in 1760, George III commissioned this new state coach with decorations by the Italian artist Giovanni Battista Cipriani. When George Washington became president, he also wanted an elegant coach. He had his old coach refurbished and decorated with a series of paintings called The Four Seasons by the same artist. After dining at the president's house in 1794, Connecticut Congressman Joshua Colt wrote this letter to his wife Nancy Colt. In it, he describes the porcelain figurines that Gouverneur Morris had bought for Washington in France. Colt wondered if Washington's style of entertaining was insufficiently American and too reminiscent of the ostentatious glitter of royal courts. George Washington and King George III were inspired by the scientific developments of their age. They were fascinated by the workings of the natural world and the practical applications of Enlightenment science. In particular, they both shared a deep interest in the new ideas about agriculture that were developed in Britain in the 18th century. They read many of the same books on these topics. George III assembled a notable collection of scientific tools and instruments. Washington also collected tools and instruments, most of which he put to practical use. George III's well-known enthusiasm for farming led to the nickname Farmer George and to caricatures like this one. Here, Queen Charlotte feeds chickens in a farmyard while the king looks on over a group of pigs feeding from a trough. Windsor Castle is visible in the distance. Arthur Young was a widely read British agricultural reformer and author. George Washington and King George III both read his works and corresponded with him. After Washington's death, Young published their correspondence and included this map of Mount Vernon's farms, which Washington had sent him. The map shows the 5 farms that made up Mount Vernon: Dog Run, Muddy Hole, Union Farm, River Farm, and Mansion House, the site of Washington's mansion. George III was also interested in innovative barns. He hired agricultural reformer Nathaniel Kent to manage Windsor Great Park, where Kent established model farms and developed this movable barn. Washington drew this design for a 6-sided barn while he was president. Horses trampled the wheat stalks on the top level, and the grain fell through slats in the floor to the granary below. Enslaved carpenters built the original barn. You can visit a recreated version of it at Mount Vernon today. Mark Catesby, an English naturalist, traveled to America in 1712 and 1722, where he gathered material for this book. Washington owned a copy, as did George III, who also owned the original paintings. Washington inherited his copy from John Custis IV, the father of Martha Washington's first husband, who was a plant collector and gardener. The exchange of plants and horticultural information between Europe and the Americas was a key feature of 18th century science. In 1782, the year after he discovered Uranus, William Herschel was appointed George III's astronomer. Herschel's sister, Carolina Herschel, assisted him in his work. In this letter, William Herschel writes to naturalist Joseph Banks for his help in persuading the king to help fund a new telescope. He also asks if Queen Charlotte might agree to provide his sister a small annual bounty, such as 50 or 60 pounds, which would make her easy for life. The Queen agreed. Henry Home, Lord James, was a Scottish judge and Enlightenment thinker. His writings advocated a scientific approach to agricultural improvement. George Washington and George III both owned copies of his book, The Gentleman Farmer. Washington copied these drawings of a drag harrow from the book. Scientist Stephen de Mainbray used this thermometer in his demonstrations. De Mainbray taught science to the future King George III and later became superintendent of the Royal Observatory at Richmond. George Washington and George III both instituted crop rotation, which helped restore the fertility of the soil. This was an important element of Britain's agricultural revolution. These crop rotation tables, created for their farms, show the similarity of their methods. Movements to abolish slavery grew in the United States and Britain during the second half of the 18th century. Neither George was convinced by the abolitionist argument, and both Georges benefited from the institution of slavery. Despite this, both Georges played a role in ending the international slave trade. Washington helped draft the U.S. Constitution, which set the nation on a path to end its participation in the international slave trade in 1808. And George III signed Britain's Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1807. Neither country outlawed slavery itself until later in the 19th century. Abolitionists boycotted sugar to signal their sympathy with the enslaved people who grew and processed it in Britain's Caribbean colonies. In this cartoon, members of the royal family express their willingness to give up sugar even as they consume it. George III and Queen Charlotte are pictured here with 2 of their daughters and the Queen's companion, Juliana Schwellenberg. George III gave his royal assent to the abolition of Britain's transatlantic slave trade in 1807. Slavery itself, however, persisted in the British Empire until 1834. While slaveholders were compensated by the British government for the loss of their human property, people formerly enslaved received no compensation for their years of enforced labor. Olaudah Equiano was an author and an abolitionist. In this memoir, he describes his birth in Africa, his capture as a child, and his enslavement in Britain and in the Americas before buying his freedom in 1766. In 1788, he wrote to Queen Charlotte, "I supplicate your Majesty's compassion for millions of my African countrymen who groan under the lash of tyranny in the West Indies." He included the letter in his book. Popular representations of George III have perpetuated the idea of the Mad King. George III experienced episodes of delusion, rapid speech, violent behavior, stomach upsets, and other symptoms on several occasions. Only 2 were serious and prolonged. One of these lasted from the fall of 1788 until early 1789. The other began in 1810 and continued until his death in 1820. There are multiple theories about what exactly the king's illness was. One theory is that he had the disease porphyria. Another theory is that he suffered from bipolar disorder. While his diagnosis remains uncertain, first-hand observations of his symptoms and behavior are preserved in the records of his doctors and in the diaries of courtiers. Robert Fulk Greville was an equerry, or a personal attendant, to King George III. From the fall of 1788 until the spring of 1789, he recorded in his diary the king's first prolonged bout of madness. On December 15, 1788, he recorded the first time the king's doctors restrained him. During the night, recourse was had for the first time to the strait waistcoat. In 1789, Washington's friend Gouverneur Morris wrote to him from Paris. He mentioned a surprising aspect of King George's madness. In the melancholy situation to which the poor King of England has been reduced, in one of his caprices, he conceived himself to be no less a personage than George Washington at the head of the American army. This shows that you have done something or other which sticks most terribly in his stomach. Upon his recovery, George III wrote to his Prime Minister, "I feel the warmest gratitude for the support and anxiety shown by the nation at large during my tedious illness." In February 1789, George III's doctors announced an entire cessation of His Majesty's illness. Parties were thrown to celebrate the king's recovery. Commemorative items, including this teacup and saucer, were made to mark the occasion. The summer after George Washington was inaugurated as the first President of the United States, the Bastille fell in France, heralding the start of the French Revolution. The turmoil in France reverberated through American politics during Washington's presidency. Americans were sharply split between those who favored establishing harmonious relations with Britain and those, including Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who favored revolution in France. As the French Revolution devolved into violence, Washington tried to maintain America's neutrality. George III, across the Channel from France, did not have that option. The last years of his reign were defined by conflict first with revolutionary France and then with Napoleon. In a coup, Napoleon became First Consul of France in November 1799, just before Washington died. On learning of the start of the French Revolution, Queen Charlotte wrote to her son Prince Augustus, "France furnishes greater but melancholy news. I often think that this cannot be the 18th century in which we live at present, for ancient history can hardly produce anything more barbarous and cruel than our neighbors in France." The French Revolution, the subsequent rise to power of Napoleon, and Napoleon's march across Europe were among the greatest challenges of George III's reign. In this cartoon, George III describes a tiny Napoleon as one of the most pernicious little odious reptiles that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Grildrig and Brobdingnag are from Jonathan Swift's novel Gulliver's Travels. George Washington retired from the presidency in 1797 after completing his second term. In doing so, he established one of the most important practices in American democracy, a peaceful transfer of power. His longed-for retirement lasted less than 3 years. He died at Mount Vernon on December 14, 1799, after a brief infection. Washington's sudden and unexpected death resulted in a national outpouring of shock and grief. In his will, George Washington asked to be buried in a private manner without parade or funeral oration. Despite his wishes, Washington's death was commemorated with symbolic funerals across the United States, including the Capitol, Philadelphia, seen here. Washington's death stimulated the production of commemorative objects such as this picture. It depicts Washington's apotheosis or ascension into heaven. He is carried by two winged allegorical figures, Immortality on the left and Father Time on the right. This image is based on a popular print by John James Bareilles. Another depiction of Washington's apotheosis appears inside the dome of the U.S. Capitol. Washington's friend, Gouverneur Morris, delivered this eulogy just weeks after Washington's death. In it, he represented the late president as the father of the country, with no child of his own to divert his attention from the citizens of the United States. "Americans," he said, "he had no child but you. He was all your own." Abraham Wood was a noted composer of sacred music and a veteran of the American Revolution. He composed this funeral elegy for Washington, which begins, "Know ye not that a great man hath fallen today? Yea, we know it, yes, we know it. Hold thou thy peace. Mourn, 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 O Americans, for Washington is no more." More than 400 mourning ceremonies were held in the weeks and months following Washington's death. These are examples of funeral orations and eulogies delivered in Washington's honor. In 1810, King George III entered his final illness from which he never fully emerged. In early 1811, with the king incompetent to reign, the Prince of Wales took over as regent. In the period known as the Regency, George III remained king, but his active rule had come to an end. His death in 1820 was long anticipated, and mourning was subdued. The Prince of Wales took over as Prince Regent in 1811 after George III entered his final episode of illness. Satirists reveled in portraying the prince's recklessness and extravagance, which contrasted with the austerity and restraint of his father. In this cartoon by George Cruikshank, the Prince Regent dances with a married woman whose cuckolded husband sits sadly behind them. The two devils play the French horn while outside the poor beg for help and two people hang from the gallows. In 1810, the Prince of Wales had submitted a set of 7 questions to the king's doctors. This questionnaire lists the prince's questions in the right-hand column. The doctor's answers are on the left. After admitting that the king was incapable of attending to business in his present state, the doctors offered some hope of his eventual recovery. They could not, however, say when that recovery might be. Artist Samuel William Reynolds made these portraits of King George III during the king's last decade when he was living in seclusion at Windsor Castle. George III, who had previously sat for many heroic portraits, appears here as he looked at the end of his life, mentally absent and losing his hearing and sight. When the Prince Regent objected to the king's long hair in the original portrait, Reynolds changed it in response, 1820. Alright guys, that's gonna wrap up my visit to view The Two Georges, Parallel Lives in an Age of Revolution exhibit at the Library of Congress. Wow, what an overwhelmingly informative, cool, and thought-provoking exhibit this was. I'm reminded that history is never just one story. It's a conversation between perspectives, ambitions, and ideals. George Washington and George III stood on opposite sides of a revolution, but both were shaped by the same age of upheaval and both left lasting legacies that continue to influence the world today. This exhibit compares not just these two men, but positions them to reflect the power of their leadership, the cost of conflict, and the enduring struggle over the meaning of freedom, for their kingdoms, for their families, for their home lives and those that lived with them, and their own personal struggles at heart as well. I hope this deepened your appreciation for both Georges as it did mine, and I'll see you another day in another adventure. Bye guys.